Okay, let's unpack this. We've been looking at a really fascinating stack of documents, analyzing this major new push in U.S. education.
Right.
And the sources, they frame this in incredibly stark terms, not just, a policy shift.
No, not at all. They call it things like the regime's war on memory.
Exactly. And one paper even labels it a curricular manifest destiny, basically saying the classroom is the new frontier for this ideological battle.
That framing really does set the stage, doesn't it? The sources we looked at, they're not treating this like your standard debate over, say, state standards.
Yeah.
They're positioning it as this fundamental struggle where the goal, they argue, is shifting conquest away from physical land to the intangible, to history, story, collective memory. So our mission today, for you listening, is to break down this powerful argument.
Yeah, let's get into the historical parallels the authors use. Some are pretty shocking and really drill into the specific ways, the sort of bureaucratic ways they claim this reshaping the curriculum is happening.
And it's happening at scale.
Oh, yeah. This whole deep dive centers on the U.S. Department of Education declaring patriotic education as a new competitive frontier. And the authors point out this comes with, what, $160 million in funding?
Exactly. $160 million. And when you declare something a competitive frontier and back it with that kind of money, well, the sources argue you're signaling a really profound top-down shift.
Right, a change in what counts as acceptable history.
Precisely. Now, $160 million is obviously a lot, but the analysis really spends time arguing that it's the allocation.
How it's used.
And that competitive declaration that matters maybe even more than the raw number itself. They position this investment as strategic, designed to, well, starve certain ideas while lavishly feeding others.
Okay, so the money isn't just a budget line. The sources see it more like a tool, maybe even a weapon.
That's the argument they make.
So let's look at who the authors claim is wielding it. The sources detail this specific coalition driving the initiative, and they use this phrase that's clearly meant to stick, a catalog of ideological decay.
It is a very charged description, definitely.
Yeah.
But the analysis does name names. Specific organizations forming this lobbying and curriculum-generating access.
Like who?
Well, they list the America First Policy Institute, Hillsdale College, curriculum creators like PragerU, and also Turning Point USA.
Right, Turning Point. And the sources use this coalition to highlight what they see as a contradiction, right? They note almost just in passing the assassination of Turning Point's co-founder.
Yeah.
An organization that, according to the analysis, is now involved in dictating whose history gets remembered and deemed valuable. It's quite the juxtaposition they draw.
It is. And so what's the core rhetoric? What are the main themes being pushed in this new mandate, according to the sources?
The language they highlight is, well, it's classic, carefully chosen stuff. Focus on things like the role of faith in the founding, emphasizing the influence of Western civilization, and really stressing how the United States has, quote, admirably grown closer to its noble principles over time.
So a narrative of continuous, almost inevitable upward progress.
Yeah, exactly, which, on the surface can sound pretty unifying. But the analysis claims these aren't just neutral descriptions. What's the critique?
Well, the authors argue these terms aren't really genuine attempts at summing up history. They actually call them incantations.
Incantations.
Yeah, recycled, they say, from centuries of conquest. The same kind of vocabulary used to justify, land seizure, manifest destiny, even enslavement.
Bro.
The critique insists the goal here isn't teaching historical inquiry or critical thinking about failures or systemic issues. It's about teaching loyalty, affirmation, compliance.
So patriotism delivered like an order, basically, instead of something grown from, real understanding or affection.
That's the argument. It replaces genuine inquiry.
Okay, this is where the author's argument gets, I think, really arresting. They bring in this central metaphor. It's striking. They compare the modern movement to the Spanish conquistadors, an inversion of health and disease.
It is. It's a very physical, visceral comparison for what seems like a fight over textbooks.
Right.
But it serves a deep purpose in their argument. The historical comparison they draw is, well, it's unsettling. The analysis describes the Spanish arriving, in the Americas, specifically places like California, carrying obvious physical signs of decay. The sources mention things like rotten teeth, bad breath, gum disease, but they proclaim themselves as the peak of civilized, enlightened society.
And the irony, which the source points out, is that they were dismissing the indigenous people they met who are physically much healthier.
Exactly. They encountered people whose hygiene, as the source puts it, outshone theirs.
Yeah.
People with traditional practices, things like fibrous brushes, herbal rinses, specific diets that kept them theoretically healthy.
But the Spanish called them diseased.
Or uncivilized, yeah.
Yeah.
Because their ways didn't match the colonizer standard.
Yeah.
The source claims this inversion, calling health disease and decay enlightenments like the foundational trick of settler colonialism, cloaking decay as health, and calling those who actually hold the medicine primitive.
Okay, so let's connect that back. How does the analysis argue that today's push for patriotic education carries that same sour breath and hollowed teeth, as they put it?
The authors see the current push for American exceptionalism, this insistence the system itself is basically perfect and just needs affirming. They see it clinging to the nation's story, like plaque.
Like plaque, okay.
Yeah, hard, calcified, tough to remove, and hiding infection underneath. The rhetoric calls itself uplifting, unifying. But the authors insist that under that shiny surface of noble principles lies, well, historical decay, hidden by a carefully managed story.
So it becomes less about teaching history and more about managing historical perception, maybe even denial.
That's the implication. And who, then, does the analysis say carries the medicine today? The cure for this historical decay?
The paper is really explicit here. It names communities with long traditions of truth-keeping, of holding on to memory often against the grain. Indigenous communities, Black communities, queer communities, immigrants, disabled communities.
Right. Their complex histories, their truths, their stories of resistance. That's the medicine, according to the source, that could restore historical health.
But they're dismissed.
Routinely dismissed, the authors argue, in this new curriculum push, labeled as corruptors, or dangerous, or just divisive. It's the same inversion, they claim, framing uncomfortable truths as if they're toxic, just played out now with bureaucratic tools instead of, swords.
Which brings us right to the mechanics. If that's the ideology, how is this curricular manifest destiny, as they call it, actually enforced? The paper argues it's not just orders from the top, it's about money, specifically starving out other views financially.
Yeah, this is where the analysis gets really into the weeds of modern bureaucratic tactics. The detail that really stands out is about specific funding actions. The paper reports that 19 out of 26 recipients of earlier federal civics grants, grants that were funding programs teaching Black history, Mexican-American history, LGBTQ+ history, 19 of them were denied continuation funding when these new patriotic priorities were established.
Wow. So it's not an outright ban, which would be maybe politically messy.
Exactly.
It's more like an administrative chokehold. You just turn off the funding tap.
Precisely. The authors explain that total erasure doesn't always need an open ban. You achieve it by, quote, starving the roots of sustenance. You do it through what looks like neutral reallocation of funds.
So programs just wither.
They wither and die from lack of resources. Meanwhile, this new patriotic coalition, the one we talked about earlier, it's being, quote, irrigated with federal dollars.
It's a calculated gardening decision, basically. Starve one patch, water another.
And the sources argue the sophistication is that the intent gets obscured by the bureaucratic process. It looks like just budgets.
Okay, so what does this funding shift mean for the classroom, according to the analysis? What specific histories are claimed to be getting erased or maybe twisted?
The paper gives several really potent examples of how memory gets managed under this kind of pressure. For instance, they claim the Tulsa Massacre, the burning of Black Wall Street, gets recast.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just a civic disturbance.
Downplaying it massively.
Or just excised, completely gone.
Eh.
Another example, Spanish missions, often presented as lovely heritage sites, right?
Yeah, part of California history.
But the analysis claims this presentation actively conceals the immense indigenous suffering, the forced labor, the mass graves, often literally beneath the mission grounds.
And what about more recent history? Does it affect that too?
Oh, yeah. The paper points to things like the Stonewall Riot, a key moment in queer resistance, stripped from texts, apparently. Pride history policed as maybe not essential or too controversial. Even hard-won visibility for disabled resistance. Things like the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. Those struggles get backbenched in curricula focused on this newly approved streamlined narrative.
So the pattern seems to be, if a history involves critique, resistance, or complexity from a marginalized group,
it gets framed as a threat to the simple positive story, and therefore gets sidelined or reshaped.
So under this model, this financially enforced model, what does civics proficiency even mean anymore, according to the source? What's the new goal?
Well, the analysis argues it stops being about learning how to say, organize or resist injustice, or even address systemic problems. Instead, civics proficiency becomes about reciting documents, affirming ideals, performing loyalty. The authors call it a form of ventriloquism.
Ventriloquism.
Yeah, like students' mouths are moving with the words of the forefathers, maybe, but their own critical thinking is silenced, or at least not encouraged. The measure of success becomes compliance, not the capacity to think critically and apply it.
It really feels like we've seen variations of this before. The analysis mentions past cycles, right? McCarthyism and textbook policing, No Child Left Behind, maybe reducing inquiry to test scores, the 1776 Commission more recently. This fight over memory seems to be like a recurring fever in American education.
It is, and the paper argues each cycle declares itself fresh and noble, necessary for unity or strength, but the underlying logic, they claim, is always about enclosure.
Enclosure.
Yeah, like fencing things in. Every time uncomfortable truths seep out, especially maybe after social movements demand. Schools teach more complete histories. The system, or parts of it, responds by trying to fence that memory back in, control the narrative again.
But the paper also suggests resistance is possible, that memory doesn't just disappear.
Exactly. If you connect it to the bigger picture, the paper insists that memory, much like the land itself in their analogy, resists being totally erased.
Can you give an example of that from the analysis, that idea of resistance?
Yeah, they use this really evocative example of the Tehachapi Ridges in California. The name itself, Tehachapi.
Okay.
It carries layers of history just in the word. Kawaiisu whispers of Tehachipia, their word for the area, then Spanish attempts to write down those sounds, then American reshaping of the name. The authors argue the name of the place itself is like a ghost of survival. It shows memory is never fully silenced, even after conquests and renaming efforts.
So that leads to their final point, which sounds a bit more hopeful maybe, that the medicine is still being offered, even if it's not in the official curriculum.
Absolutely. The paper does conclude on that note, that even with the political pressure, the funding cuts, teachers keep teaching these histories anyway. Students keep asking the hard questions. Communities keep holding on to memory through stories, protests.
So they're preserving the complex record, even if it's denied space in the official story.
They are. But the core tragedy the source implies still remains.
Which is, if this truth offers healing, why would the proponents of this new curriculum refuse the medicine? Why push back against it?
Well, that's the ultimate contradiction the paper leaves you with, right? Power, historically, rarely accepts medicine from those it has labeled inferior or dangerous. The authors conclude, pretty starkly, that those pushing this rigid curriculum would rather die of infection than admit that health lies in the hands of the dismissed. They'd rather perpetuate the historical rot, basically, than admit truth comes from the very histories they're trying to silence.
Okay, so to try and synthesize this deep dive for you listening, we've looked at sources arguing that memory itself has become this new frontier of conquest, driven by a really shocking historical metaphor, decay, denial, cloaked in patriotic language.
Right. And we've seen the argument about the calculated reality behind it, that bureaucratic actions, specifically these targeted funding cuts, can serve the same purpose as older forms of conquest, like seizing land. It's just quieter, maybe, more administrative.
Yeah.
And this raises a really important final question that the analysis leaves us pondering.
Yeah.
The authors argue the biggest danger isn't actually that truth vanishes completely, because the stories survive, the land remembers, as they say.
Right.
The danger is that a generation of kids grows up without the official permission or maybe even the vocabulary to name that truth when they encounter it, leading to what they call a phantom pain, like missing teeth in the national mouth.
Wow. A history that haunts but isn't recognized or treated. So if the goal of the current politically driven curriculum is, as these sources argue, not really about the capacity to think critically, but more about the willingness to comply, here's a final thought for you to consider. What specific, non-sanctioned historical story, maybe one from your own community, your own local history, what story might be considered the most potent form of that medicine today? Something to explore as you think about these ongoing battles over what actually makes it into the curriculum.